basically I'm going to talk to you from the TSA's point of view, from the point of view of a family organisation, and how we started at the very beginning and then took the process to the end for one particular treatment, although I have to say now that that's not the end of the story by any means. So, as you will all know, there are particular issues for rare diseases. First is actually, these are going to be the chapters of the talk, and so I'm going to talk about very briefly about defining the disease, finding champions who will then look after patients and start the research, where guidelines fit in, stimulating research and translation. I mean, in terms of defining the disease, it was a particular challenge with tuberous sclerosis and some other diseases. It's not so for every rare disease, but if you've got a very complex, multifaceted disease, then you need to be able to define your population so that you know you are actually researching into patients with your rare disease, looking for the right gene, and then also to define the population you're going to treat when you finally get some treatment. And that verges into finding champions, because it's the champions that do that. Guidelines are important because that's where research starts, when you've run out of the best possible care. In terms of finding champions, the way the TSA did it was to start setting up TS clinics, and that was quite difficult because the NHS did not, and has not to this day, funded any TS clinics directly. So clinicians have had to be persuaded to spare some of their time or write into their job plan time to look after patients with our particular rare disease. And sometimes that's a particular a multidisciplinary TS clinic, as with the model in some places. Sometimes it's a part out of other clinics, but it's finding those clinicians who will be enthusiastic. And the way the TSA eventually found them was to go through the families. So a family would come across a particularly empathetic clinician, and then they'd be kind of ruthlessly targeted, I have to say. And part of that was putting on study days, and study days for both professionals to talk about what the disease involved, what therapies were currently available, and study days for patients and families, and to get those champions to come and talk at study days. And at first, the usual response was, well, I don't really know much about tuberous sclerosis. Yes, but you know about refractory epilepsy. Come and talk to us about that. And then we would kind of, because clinicians are professional people, they will look up TS, and then I'll start to, we kind of seduce them into becoming interested in our rare disease. Next stage is conferences and consensus conferences. Particularly in a rare disease, you need a forum for researchers to present their research and to interact with each other. And if you can do it for as a whole conference in your particular field, so much the better. Sometimes there are particular rare diseases that already have sponsors and professional advocacy groups, and then you just tack onto those. In our case, there weren't any, and so that's the patient organisations are the people who have persuaded academics and researchers and clinicians to form groups, and have continually facilitated that and then fed back to them. Patient family days are important for keeping the patient group involved and for fundraising, and there's a two-way process between that. And the fundraising is important because the very best way to be able to influence the research strategy is to be able to give out some money. And the first amount of money that was raised for TS research back in the 70s by a particular family up in Nottingham worked very hard, raised a large amount of money, gave it to the TSA. The TSA advertised in the British Medical Journal saying, is anyone interested in doing TS research? We have a grant of up to £30,000, which in those days was a lot. No one answered that advert first time round. They had to wait a couple of weeks and put it again in the BMJ, and then 2 people answered, and they became leading researchers in TSC over the next 2 decades. So giving out money is helpful, but also combined grants with other organisations. Setting up conferences and funding conferences, which initially, if you're going to start a conference from scratch, not tacked onto a professional organisation, you need to find it to fund it, and but that you can often get sponsorship for that. Lobbying is important in terms of you lobby academics, you lobby the NHS, That's a large part of what we do in the TSA as a rare disease group. And finding collaborators. So our illness patients have refractory epilepsy, they have severe intellectual impairment, autism, other challenging behaviour. There are other groups who also focus on those, so working together can be very helpful. And then it's, to make any progress at all, it takes, as Katrina was saying, basic research to understand what's going on. And also clinical research to get a clear picture of how things are and what you might be able to intervene with. That will then feed into your strategy. So in order to influence the research agenda, a patient group needs to come up with those targeted product characteristics, but I've forgotten the name. But Katrina's saying you need to say what needs to be done. And then you need to facilitate that, both with money and with putting researchers in touch. And of course, we've come a long way in the last 3 decades. Patient and public input has gone from the barely tolerated to the become fashionable, and now it's mandatory in terms of getting and maintaining grants. So that's very helpful for us, and we should play on that ruthlessly. That's just to show you what our overall current strategy is like. I don't want to concentrate on any bits of that, but just to say the research is in the grey box in the middle, and it's all integrated, and it's really a way of setting our priorities and working to deadlines, having key performance indicators so we know what we're doing when we're doing it, and it's quite a business. What it's meant was that over the past 40 years, TSA itself has raised about 7 million. Probably the joint grants have been 10 to 15 times that amount into research into TSC, and that's just in the UK. The United States has done particularly well as well. And that's another factor, of course. If you're sitting as a rare disease group in the UK, you're not alone. It's an international problem for most rare diseases, and there are groups in every country, and collaborating with them is useful. Any research that's successful anywhere is applicable everywhere. But understanding the pathophysiology, the pathobiology of the disease is the fundamental, and that started for us with the genes. It turned out to be that there were 2 genes. That leads into what goes wrong. And on this slide, that the names I've put up, this is just a quick history of some of the early work. Those names are principal investigators who received grants from the TSA. And at first, this search for the gene and the beginning to find it was an entirely UK initiative, but now it's spread out worldwide. And that, once you have the gene, that has some immediate benefits, because we can do gene testing, pregnancy counselling, etc. Back in 1997, when we discovered the second gene, Frank Collins, the leader of the whole human genome project, gave a quote at one of the international TS conferences in the United States and Washington, and said that it's not the end, but it is perhaps the beginning of the end. Perhaps the end, not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning, which was very right. We had a long way to go. But this is a very kind of stylized schematic view of the pathway that's key to TS biology. All those steps actually have molecular pathways in, and I'll spare you the more complex slide, but basically the genes control a switch in the cells that turn on the message for the cell to grow and to divide. And cells that are affected by the TS gene mutations, once you get the second natural wild-type gene knocked out, become TS cells and cause malformations in the brain, which causes some of the CNS inhibition, and also tumours throughout the body. At the point where there was quite a gap between finding the genes and trying to work out exactly what they did, but eventually made progress with more basic research. And at that point, we had a piece of good luck. And some of our story is hard graft, and some is lucky breaks. So this was our first really lucky break, in that there was a drug already marketed for other things that affected this pathway, called Sirolimus, or Rapamycin originally. It was found on Rapa Nui, Easter Island, and they were actually looking for an antibiotic, but found it was immunosuppressant when used in high dose, so too toxic as an antibiotic. But just to go back, but that mTOR pathway in the middle, the switch that gets turned on when the genes aren't working, it's a competitive inhibitor for the pathway, and it turns that switch off, so it controls the TS cells. And that was great, and we immediately, of course, started exploiting that. It was realized that that was going on in the Bath conference. They put together some work in yeasts, some work in fruit flies, and what we knew about the human pathobiology. And that led to another conference at the Royal Society of Medicine to try and stimulate the research in that field. And a plan to start treating animal models, cells in chest tubes, and humans with the inhibitor. So, leading on to drug development, of course, you need, as Katrina says, you need industry partners to take that. It's a big investment, and it's whoever invests in it wants to have all that money back, and preferably some profit. One hook for a pharma company is that it's like Amazon's long tail. It might be a rare disease, but these patients are going to continue to need that drug for a long period of time, and therefore there'll be continued market for a long period of time. What cuts that off in terms of investment is the patent life, and you can extend patents with special interest groups, but it is a limiting factor, and one of the reasons drugs are so expensive. And one of the solutions, of course, is to make patent life for rare disease drugs much longer. So we do worldwide TS research community by then, i.e. the family organisations and the researchers they were collaborating with, had already funded lots of research into test tubes in different countries, animal models, and so early studies started. As Katrina said, registries are very important because you need to know for studies where to find the disease, or where to find the patients. And also funders need to have some idea of how many patients there are and what it will cost them if they can going to fund things. But it also is excellent for following natural history and working out where you can alter the natural history. And then from those databases come the volunteers. But in a rare disease like TS, there's no shortage of volunteers. 99% patients and families volunteer for any research that's going. The early research for us was done with Sirolimus or Rapamycin, and that was looking at the tumours in the kidneys. Then we hit a problem because the Sirolimus was already off patent, and it was the last stages of that drug development or those drug trials was kind of begging and borrowing drug free from Wyeth, who was making Sirolimus at the time, which they gave us very reluctantly, really. And it looked like we were going to hit a problem that no one was going to be able to commercialize the product. Luckily, mTOR inhibitors, this is our second big lucky break in this particular instance. mTOR inhibitors are also used in cancer. And they're moderate help in cancer in combination with other things. They're useless on their own. But there are a lot of drug companies interested in mTOR inhibitors. And so Sirolimus, one of their top scientists, bless him, asked them to interrupt their cancer testing program and stick tuberous sclerosis in the middle on the explanation that if they got on board with a rare disease, it could be profitable for them long term, which is what they did. Had they not done that, had tuberous sclerosis come at the end of their program, they would run out of patent life before it was worth them mounting any studies, so it would have been tricky. But that meant they invested in some big placebo-controlled trials. Well, big for a rare disease. There's 100 patients in XIS1 looking at brain tumours, 100 patients in XIS2 looking at kidney tumours. The MILES study was slightly different. That was funded by the NIH, and that was for pulmonary LAM, the lung involvement. And that was with Sirolimus because it's 10 times cheaper. And that led to licensing of Sirolimus for that product, and which, because it's quite cheap relatively for a severe disease, means that funding is not an issue for Sirolimus. It is for everolimus, though, because they still are still keen to make the money back that they've invested. Other landmark trials were a topical Sirolimus study, which has been looking at the facial rash, and which works very well, but it's been going on the work's been going on for 15 years because there isn't enough money to drive it forward fast. It looks like that now that there are some independent companies going to commercialize that product, which would be great. And then one of the major problems in TS is refractory epilepsy. And the refractory epilepsy study has just finished and shows significant benefit in those patients. So in terms of TS patients, so the lifetime risks of serious illness or death are these. Seizure is a brain tumour, renal tumours causing bleeds or renal failure, lung failure from LAM, refractory epilepsy, which is kind of quite devastating. It drives unless it's stopped early, it drives more epilepsy, stops brain development, causes autism, other challenging behaviour, causes intellectual impairment, but it can be stopped at the start. And then all the neuropsychiatric leftover problems, which most patients get, but we haven't cracked yet. However, for the solid tumours, they can be halted in their tracks if someone will fund the medicine. It's just an illustration of the challenge of the next step. So this is just refractory. The top line here is a placebo effect. It's not sustained long term, but it's 14% like any other placebo. And then the reduction in seizure frequency. About 20% of patients with refractory epilepsy who are treated with another anticonvulsant, a conventional one, 1% of those refractory epilepsy will be stopped. With everolimus, it's 20%, and with everolimus, 60% will have significant improvement that will have a major effect on their quality of life. So it is a successful treatment, but funding has already been turned down once by NHS England. Partly because it's expensive, partly because they feel there's too many patients and the unit cost is too high, partly because they don't really understand the subject, and they're not like they had a nice appraisal for this, but they ignored most of the evidence. So it can be very challenging, and the civil servants at NHS specialised services not really set up or equipped to understand exactly how to put out proportion the funds that they're given, really. Partly there's too many rare diseases, but also they don't have the backup and the academic resources to fully assess cost effectiveness and treatment. So funding for LAM only took about a year from license to in England to funding becoming available, and that's because Sirolimus is quite cheap, about £3,000 a year. Funding for everolimus is up to 30,000, although of course the NHS can negotiate discounts with pharma companies, and they can be as much as 50%, as long as they're kept secret. The AML funding took 4 years of very hard graft and lobbying on the TSA's part to get through. Seizure funding took even longer, and that's because the understanding for the funders was that surgery was an alternative treatment. But actually it's not alternative treatment for people in whom surgery is contraindicated or in whom it's failed and it can't work. Those patients will die, and they're usually children. So at that point, at some point in 2017, I have to say the TSA became hysterical in public, and there was lots of nastiness in the press and media, which we are quite good at using. That caused NHS to be bruised and battered and lost us lots of friends inside the camp. And then came the epilepsy results, so we're still arguing that. There's been another round of decision-making, which they've kept secret, not told us about. They have agreed to refer it to NICE, if necessary. So it is important to try and get the civil servants on side and to engage them one-to-one. There are some outstandingly good ones in the department in NHS, but there's also a lot of ones that just want to get on the bus home. Politicians can be very useful because the politicians employ the civil servants nominally when there's a stable government, and then not an election pending. Then the civil servants are unscared of the Minister of Health. So any MPs get at the Minister of Health, the Minister of Health can get, or the Prime Minister's office can get at the civil servants. And the media can be very useful. For us, of course, it's not the end because a lot of people are damaged by TS, and we would like to start treatment right at the beginning. And we've had a concept of TS Cure, an international collaboration of researchers decided that a trial in very early infancy would be most useful. We have animal models, and we have case histories, case results that show that that is very effective at preventing most of the complications. But it's a question of what is a cure. So for any rare disease, a cure is usually controlling the problem. Once you've got it, it's not preventing it. There are some that may respond to gene therapy. I think a lot like TS, it's going to be too complex. And also, mTOR inhibitors for us have been extraordinary step forward, but they're not the full answer. They control the disease, they don't cure it. They have significant side effects in some people. So we're still looking for something better, for things that will kill TS cells. And that's a problem because we already have a pretty successful treatment. There's much less money for investment. It's called the pipeline of death in one oncology researcher in America. The way to get around that is to kind of refocus, redraw your strategy, get the experts together, conferences, get more grants and more industry buy-in, and hopefully keep pushing things forward. And that's all I was going to say.